Back when I was just getting into anime, a friend of mine told me to watch Fullmetal Alchemist. But not the first adaptation, he said. That one wasn't as good anyway. So he told me to make sure that I just watched Brotherhood, the second adaptation that stays closer to its source material, and to leave it at that. Unfortunately, being a fool, I listened to him and I watched Brotherhood first. For the first 10 episodes or so of the series, I was wondering what on earth was supposed to be so good about it, and I would have stopped watching if it wasn't for the fact that everyone seemed absolutely obsessed with it. I'm definitely glad that I kept going, because the show does get great, but boy does it take a long time to get there. And there's a simple reason for that. Brotherhood was almost certainly created under the assumption that its viewers had already either read the manga or seen the 2003 anime. In case you're unaware of the 2003 anime, it's a series that was made while the manga was still ongoing, and instead of adding a ton of filler episodes throughout the series while they waited for the manga to get further along, or delaying the series for a long time, the creators chose to move forward with their own story. See, Brotherhood and the 2003 anime on the surface start out quite similar, and cover very similar ground. But the similar ground they cover is handled much better in the 2003 anime than in Brotherhood, and I wish I'd watched the 2003 series first. Unfortunately, in order to adequately discuss my stance on this, I'm going to need to get into some spoilers. However, I will only be discussing spoilers that pertain to the first few episodes of each series. The 2003 adaptation is brimming with its own personality, a personality that is far darker than what is shown in the manga or Brotherhood. In no other moment is this more clear than when comparing the opening moments of the manga, the 2003 anime, and Brotherhood. The manga only takes one page to show us this scene, where Ed and Elle have failed at transmuting their mother. I can't say that I mind, that's not the focus of this chapter, nor should it be. It's important that the focus of this chapter is on someone grappling with the idea of what the truth is, and seeing how difficult it is for someone to accept the truth. That is, after all, what I see as the most important theme in both the manga and Brotherhood. In that way, it was very intelligent to not dwell on the past, but to use that as an intriguing set of images for the reader to think about. The 2003 adaptation focuses heavily on this moment, giving us a glance at all of the supplies Ed and Elle have for their experiment. And it's obvious because of these supplies that that's exactly what the show is opening up with, an experiment, and one that sounds like it should be successful, at least based on the music, with a horn playing a fairly simple and victorious sounding melody. The music swells into a crescendo of strings and other instruments, resolving up as the boys stare at their experiment. But then, as we are told about the laws of alchemy, things start to go wrong. The music is still energetic, but it sounds brooding. The once bright experiment turns dark and the screen goes black as we are told about equivalent exchange. We are shown a dark and stormy night, Winry and her grandma bursting out of their home, Roy Mustang standing on the top of a hill. Lightning flashes across the sky, rain falls down from above. Everything about this moment is dark. Everything about it is oppressive. Ed sees what he's created, a monster, and the screen goes black. He screams. In 2003, the focus on this moment right at the beginning of the series is so important, because this anime, more than the manga and more than Brotherhood, centers around human transmutation. Not around the truth, really, at least not the same way it does in the manga and Brotherhood, but around human transmutation, around what sorts of evils are incurred upon the world when men and women try to become gods, and what is going to need to be sacrificed for something like a life to be given back. Brotherhood, meanwhile, doesn't open up with the scene at all, and instead begins with an anime original episode that serves as a reintroduction to the characters you all know and love. Well, I mean, that you hopefully know and love, because otherwise this episode honestly doesn't have much merit, and I really don't think it's supposed to. This episode, if viewed by somebody who hasn't read the manga or seen the 2003 anime, attempts to show us Roy Mustang, the Fuhrer, Ed, Al, Hughes, Hawkeye, this new guy, Kimberly, and many more characters. It's an overload of information for somebody who isn't at all familiar with this story, and unfortunately I'm speaking from personal experience. But enough bitching about the first episode. Let's talk about what it does right, because it does a really good job of a number of things. Let's, for a moment, view this thing as the reintroduction it was almost certainly meant to be, where every moment makes the audience excited because they're getting to see some of their favorite characters again. Through that lens, this episode is pretty great. Ed and Al get this grandiose introduction backed up by an entirely new soundtrack that suits this series really well. We see some awesome fights that didn't exist in the previous anime or the manga. For people who know about these characters and won't be so distracted by them that they forget about some of the plot points mentioned in this episode, the Ishval War and the idea of human sacrifices are brought up very early on. And even if this episode may be a bit confusing for newbies to the series, there are great fights, a main character who's competent and quite charming, and fairly snappy dialogue. We also get to hear Ed's theme, which I love. I love it so much. It sounds tragic and brooding, but it still has a certain charge and energy to it that so wonderfully encapsulates his character. So, all in all, it's far from a terrible episode, and it may even be a pretty great episode for those who are already familiar with the world, its characters, and some of the plot points of the manga. But as far as I'm concerned, it has nothing on the way the manga introduces us to the themes of truth and ignorance through the LIORE chapters, and it definitely isn't as powerful as the disturbing introduction to Ed and Al's botched human transmutation in the 2003 anime. So let's talk about the LIORE incident, where Ed and Al go journeying in the hopes of finding out more about the Philosopher's Stone. In all three versions, the LIORE incident serves a very similar purpose. We are supposed to see the danger of a man who views himself as God, Ed's amazing abilities as a prodigy of sorts, Ed and Al's want for the Philosopher's Stone, how far they're willing to go to get their hands on it, some of the dangers that go along with human transmutation, and the harm that can come from turning away from or ignoring the truth. The manga, more than either of the two animes, focuses the most on that last one, the danger of turning away from the truth. The most impactful moments in these chapters are ones where Rose is forced to choose between Father Cornello or Ed's logic and rationalization. With her want to bring her boyfriend back to life, it's hard for her to accept what Ed is trying to tell her. That human transmutation can't happen, that it won't happen, that she needs to accept that and move on. Just look at this page, which is one of my favorites in the whole manga, where Rose is trying to choose between Ed and Al's truth or Cornello's lies. In the manga, these are lies that she knows are lies, but she still doesn't want to turn away from them because then what does she have left? The truth? A truth that's cruel, harsh, cold, and relentless. She is faced with a moral dilemma, a dilemma similar to the one that Ed and Al encountered long ago, though we, as the readers, do not quite know that yet if we've only consumed the manga. In this way, Ed and Al's fears and the tragedy that so often defines their characters are explored through Rose. The 2003 adaptation and Brotherhood both largely keep these ideas intact, but they do make one particularly large change. The situation Rose is put in when she makes her decision is very different in both of them. In neither adaptation is Rose smuggled into the room where we meet Cornello and Hidden while he gives his very typical villain speech, going over how stupid all his believers are and so on. And in neither version are Ed and Cornello so often compared to one another while simultaneously acting in opposition to each other. Instead, in the 2003 series, she is standing beside Cornello when Ed and Al enter, and she watches him do some incredibly questionable things. But he never reveals himself to be quite as insane and manipulative as he really is. Because of this, she is not yet put in the same situation of choosing between these two ideas. Later she is, in a more subtle way that is only shown in the 2003 anime, when she sees her boyfriend's silhouette but then notices the feathers that surround his bed. Though it is never stated, the intent here is clear. She knows that something is wrong, but she doesn't want to admit that. In 2003, there's more room for interpretation this way. So all in all, 2003 didn't change anything that much about the overall message of the importance of choosing truth over lies, even if it was a bit less direct with its characters and with the viewer about these things. Brotherhood, on the other hand, does something very strange, considering that it was made with pretty much the sole intent of following the manga closer than the 2003 series. Rose doesn't come to know of Cornello's evil until everyone else in the city does, when Ed broadcasts Cornello's voice. The reason for this is that in Brotherhood, she isn't smuggled into the room where they talk to Cornello. He is aware of her presence throughout their conversation and never says anything that's entirely damning. Again, he does some very questionable things, but not anything that makes it immediately obvious to Rose that he's this evil person and that he's not at all the benevolent father he's made himself out to be. Now, this might not seem like a very big deal. She still learns, after all, of Cornello's evil deeds and intent, but there's not the same personal weight behind it. When she makes the decision to follow lies even after she knows so much of the truth, it's both frustrating and sad in the manga and in the 2003 adaptation. Meanwhile, in Brotherhood, everything just feels so routine with this entire episode. In fact, it feels like the creators are just going, well, you've almost certainly already seen this, but we still have to at least show this for those who haven't and won't. This mentality permeates every aspect of this episode, including the fact that it's been crammed into one episode instead of two. and no other aspect of this episode suffers more than its shot composition and cinematography. Maybe this is a personal thing, but I really don't like it when a TV show or movie mimics a comic book's or manga's page layout without any particular meaning behind it. Anime and film is a different medium than comics and manga, so in my mind at least, this sort of composition shouldn't really be happening at all, never mind as much as it does in this episode. Sure, there's one cool moment where Ed and Al become these sorts of silhouettes and their bodies are filled in with an image of the sun god, a visual way of reminding us that these two people have encroached upon God's territory by attempting human transmutation. But that's about the only moment of this episode that I have anything that positive to say about, at least as far as cinematography is concerned. And the humor it injects in many areas with visual and audio gags also simply distract from the overall point of this episode. I mean, I guess that might be somewhat entertaining, but what's the purpose here? Don't they overall just downplay the importance of Rose's emotions and feelings? You know how I mentioned that the manga only spends a page really dwelling on the Elric brothers' horrifying past in its opening chapters? Well, Brotherhood chooses to show Ed and Al's past before LIORE, despite the fact that it takes a long time for us to see nearly that much detail about Ed and Al's past in the manga. I don't have a particular problem with this in Brotherhood, but I did at first find it strange that Brotherhood chose to do this. As I've said too many times already, the whole LIORE incident does a great job of showing the main theme of the overall series. So showing the kid's tragic past first seemed a bit backwards to me, at least until I thought about it a bit more. The flashback episode in Brotherhood puts a lot of emphasis on the truth and on this gate. Showing it now and giving it all this emphasis is an incredibly intelligent decision and a great change to make that both highlights the manga's major plot points and themes. The horror of the failed human transmutation, while still an element of Brotherhood's episode, is not nearly the same as in the 2003 anime. But it does a great job of showing how crushed Ed is after the botched experiment, and of his resolve after the fact, proclaiming that even if recovery would usually take 3 years, he'll do it in 1. We see him becoming a state alchemist and his arrogance, which is an important part of his character. Though the third episode of this series, which is the LIORE incident, takes away from its themes in the ways that I described earlier, much of that is shown in this episode, so perhaps that's why the creators didn't think it was so important to put all that focus on the third episode. In addition, this moment with the truth makes it clear that Ed lost his leg in exchange for his abilities to transmute without a transmutation circle, and shows it in a very interesting way, with the truth stealing Ed's leg and saying this is equivalent exchange. A great way to show how horrifying the truth's notion of equivalent exchange can be. 2003, however, also has a similar flashback episode in its third episode, after the LIORE incident, and in many ways I prefer it to Brotherhood's episode that covers many of the same things. There are 2 elements of this episode that really make it better for me. First, there's the beginning of the episode, where Ed and Al are making a gift for Winry using alchemy. However, she's scared of alchemy and ends up crying and afraid. It's a fantastic way of showing how the general public and non-alchemists likely feel about alchemy, how powerful it is, and the dangers that it holds. Second, there's the fact that we see Winry in the moments right after she's learned about her parents' death, which gives the death an immediately personal sting that isn't present in the manga or Brotherhood. Learning about this now also helps us to understand how important Ed and Al's mother is to them, as they run up to her and cry because they're afraid that they would be hurt if they ever lost her. And that's exactly what's going to happen, of course. That's exactly what's going to destroy them. Also, as I've stated earlier, I just like the tone of 2003's early episodes far more. The art style is a bit less polished perhaps and a bit less cartoony, if that makes any sense. There's a sense of seriousness to it. Brotherhood's art style works very well for the shonen adventure it's going to become, but that's not what the show is in these moments. In these moments, it's a character piece about 2 young boys who lose their mother, the loss they feel, the foolish mistake they make, and the bond that they share. The bond they share. That's something that's so important in 2003. We see Ed and Al reaching for one another as Al is ripped away. That's why it's so smart for this series to use this flashback early on, despite the fact that the manga doesn't. One of the most major ideas in this series is that Ed and Al just want to be close together again, both in body and in mind. Ed is all Al has left in many ways, and Al is all that Ed has left. Al even goes as far as to say, I don't want us to ever be separated again. So in the end, I think the inclusion of this flashback is intelligent in both Brotherhood and the 2003 anime, even if I prefer 2003's take on the events. Brotherhood does a great job of establishing the importance of the truth, even if its take on the LIORE incident is rushed and some of the slight changes take away from its overall impact. 2003, meanwhile, does a great job of carving out its own identity, of expanding on its source material, and of focusing on the dangers of human transmutation and on the brothers' bond more than the manga or Brotherhood. And the manga does a great job of establishing its major theme of the danger of ignorance and how important it is to accept the truth, even if it may be hard to swallow. Thank you for watching this video. It's the first part of what will for sure be at least a 2-part series. It might go longer than that. So if you'd like to hear more of me talking about Fullmetal Alchemist and comparing Brotherhood in 2003 to the manga, please subscribe. And remember to like this video if you could. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I hope you're having a great day. Bye-bye.